Sorry for the abrupt ending. I had a phone call from my sissy Teresa Patton and my little sissy, the crotchety clogger Mary Ann. You're going to be seeing each other. And I can't go because I got the appointment with the lymphedema clinic, and it took me for freaking ever to get the appointment, and I canceled the first one, or rescheduled. I'm not sure where I was, but I'm just going to start what I think may have been the last sentence or so where I was. Mr. Cheggs came not alone or unsupported, for he prudently brought along with him his sister, Miss Cheggs, who, making straight to Miss Sophie, and taking her by both hands, and kissing her on both cheeks, hoped in an audible whisper that they had not come too early. "Too early? No," replied Miss Sophie. "Oh, my dear," rejoined Miss Cheggs in the same whisper as before, "I've been so tormented, so worried, and it's a mercy we were not here at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Alec, A-L-I-C-K, has been in such a state of impatience to come. You'd hardly believe that he was dressed before dinner time and has been looking at the clock and teasing me ever since. It's all your fault, you naughty thing." Hereupon Miss Sophie blushed, and Miss Cheggs, who was bashful before ladies, blushed too. Mr. Cheggs, and Miss Sophie's mother and sisters, to prevent Mr. Cheggs from blushing more, lavished civilities and attentions upon him, and left Richard Swiveller to take care of himself. Here was the very thing he wanted. Here was good cause, reason, and foundation for pretending to be angry. But having this cause, reason, and foundation, which he had come expressly to seek, not expecting to find, Richard Swiveller was angry in sound earnest, and wondered what the devil Cheggs meant by his impudence. However, Mr. Swiveller had Miss Sophie's hand for the first quadrille, Q-U-A-D-R-I-L-L-E, in parentheses, country dances being low were utterly proscribed, and so gained an advantage over his rival, who sat despondingly in a corner and contemplated the glorious figure of the young lady as she moved through the mazy dance. Nor was this the only start Mr. Swiveller had of the market gardener for determining to show the family what quality of man they trifled with, and influenced perhaps by his late libations, I thought that was all one word, he performed such feats of agility and such spins and twirls as filled the company with astonishment, and in particular caused a very long gentleman, who was dancing with a very short scholar, to stand quite transfixed by wonder and admiration. Even Mrs. Wackles forgot for the moment to snub 3 small young ladies who were inclined to be happy, and could not repress a rising thought that to have such a dancer as that in the family would be a pride indeed. At this momentous crisis, Miss Cheggs proved herself a vigorous and useful ally, for not confining herself to expressing by scornful smiles a contempt for Mr. Swiveller's accomplishments. She took every opportunity of whispering into Miss Sophie's ear expressions of condolence and sympathy on her being worried by such a ridiculous creature, declaring that she was frightened to death lest Alec should fall upon and beat him in the fullness of his wrath, and entreating Miss Sophie to observe how the eyes of the said Alec gleamed, which, being too much for his eyes, rushed into his nose also, and suffused it with a crimson glow. "You must dance with Miss Cheggs," said Miss Sophie to Dick Swiveller, after she herself had danced twice with Mr. Cheggs, and made great show of encouraging his advances. "She's a nice girl, and her brother's quite delightful." "Quite delightful, is he?" muttered Dick. "Quite delighted, too, I should say, from the manner in which he's looking this way." Here Miss Jane, previously instructed for the purpose, interposed her many curls and whispered her sister to observe how jealous Mr. Cheggs was. "Jealous? Like his impudence," said Richard Swiveller. "His impudence, Mr. Swiveller," said Miss Jane, tossing her head. "Take care he don't hear you, sir, or you may be sorry for it." "Oh, pray, Jane," said Miss Sophie. "Nonsense," replied her sister. "Why shouldn't Mr. Cheggs be jealous if he likes? I like that, certainly. Mr. Cheggs has as good a right to be jealous as anyone else has, and perhaps he may have a better right soon if he hasn't already. You know best about that, Sophie." Though this was a concerted plot between Miss Sophie and her sister, originating in humane intentions and having for its object the inducing Mr. Swiveller to declare himself in time, it failed in its effect. For Miss Jane, being one of those young ladies who are prematurely shrill and shrewish, gave such undue importance to her part that Mr. Swiveller retired in dudgeon. Oops. Sorry. It went away. Dudgeon. A feeling of offense or deep resentment. Dudgeon. I guess is how you pronounce it. Resigning his mistress to Mr. Cheggs and conveying a defiance into his looks, which that gentleman indignantly returned. "Did you speak to me?" said Mr. Cheggs, following him into a corner. "Have the kindness to smile, sir, in order that we may not be suspected. Did you speak to me, sir?" Mr. Swiveller looked with a supercilious smile at Mr. Cheggs' toes, then raised his eyes from them to his ankles, from that to his shin, from that to his knee, and so on very gradually, keeping up his right leg until he reached his waistcoat, when he raised his eyes from button to button until he reached his chin, and traveling straight up the middle of the nose came at last to his eyes, when he said abruptly, "No, sir, I didn't." Said Mr. Cheggs, glancing over his shoulder. "Have the goodness to smile again, sir. Perhaps you wish to speak to me, sir." "No, sir, I didn't do that either." "Perhaps you may have nothing to say to me now, sir," said Mr. Cheggs fiercely. At these words, Richard Swiveller withdrew his eyes from Mr. Cheggs' face, and traveling down the middle of his nose and down his waistcoat, down his right leg, reaching his toes again, and carefully surveyed him. This done, he crossed over, and coming up the other leg, and thence approaching by the waistcoat as before, said when he got to his eyes, "No, sir, I haven't." "Oh, indeed, sir," said Mr. Cheggs. "I'm glad to hear it. You know where I'm to be found, I suppose, sir, in case you should have anything to say to me?" "I can easily inquire, sir, when I want to know." "There's nothing more we need to say, I believe, sir." "Nothing more, sir." With that they closed the tremendous dialogue by frowning mutually. Mr. Cheggs hastened to tender his hat to Miss Sophie, and Mr. Swiveller set himself down in a corner in a very moody state. Hard by this corner, Mrs. Wackles and Miss Wackles were seated, looking on at the dance, and unto Mrs. and Miss Wackles, Miss Cheggs occasionally darted when her partner was occupied with his share of the figure, and made some remark or other which was gall and wormwood to Richard Swiveller's soul. looking into the eyes of Mrs. and Miss Wackles for encouragement, and sitting very upright and uncomfortable on a couple of hard stools were two of the day scholars. And when Miss Wackles smiled and Mrs. Wackles smiled, the two little girls on the stools sought to curry favor by smiling likewise in gracious acknowledgment, of which attention the old lady frowned them down instantly, and said if they dared to be guilty of such impertinence again, they should be sent under convoy to their respective homes. This threat caused one of the young ladies, she being of a weak and trembling temperament, to shed tears, and for this offense they were both filed off immediately with a dreadful promptitude that struck terror into the souls of all the pupils. "I've got such news for you," said Miss Cheggs, approaching once more. "Alec has been saying such things to Sophie. Upon my word, you know it's quite serious and in earnest. That's clear." "What's he been saying, my dear?" demanded Mr. Wackles. "All manner of things," replied Miss Cheggs. "You can't think how out he has been speaking." Richard Swiveller considered it advisable to hear no more, but taking advantage of a pause in the dancing and the approach of Mr. Cheggs to pay his court to the old lady, swaggered with an extremely careful assumption of extreme carelessness toward the door, passing on the way Miss Jane Wackles, who, in all the glory of her curls, was holding a flirtation, in parentheses, as good practice when no better was to be had, with a feeble old gentleman who lodged in the parlor. Near the door sat Miss Sophie, still fluttered and confused by the attentions of Mr. Cheggs, and by her side Richard Swiveller lingered for a moment to exchange a few parting words. "My boat is on the shore and my bark is on the sea, but before I pass this door I will say farewell to thee," murmured Dick, looking gloomily upon her. "Are you going?" said Miss Sophie, whose heart sank within her at the result of her stratagem, but who affected a light indifference notwithstanding. "Am I going?" echoed Dick bitterly. "Yes, I am. What then?" "Nothing, except that it's very early," said Miss Sophie, "but you are your own master, of course." "I would that I had been my own mistress too," said Dick, "before I had ever entertained a thought of you, Miss Wackles. I believed you true, and I was blessed in so believing, but now I mourn that ere I knew a girl so fair, yet so deceiving." Miss Sophie bit her lip and affected to look with great interest after Mr. Cheggs, who was quaffing lemonade in the distance. "I came here," said Dick, rather oblivious of the purpose with which he had really come, "with my bosom expanded, my heart dilated, and my sentiments of a corresponding description. I go away with feelings that may be conceived but cannot be described, feeling within myself that desolating truth that my best affections have experienced this night a stifler." "I am sure I don't know what you mean, Mr. Swiveller," said Miss Sophie with downcast eyes. "I'm very sorry if—" "Sorry, ma'am," said Dick. "Sorry in the possession of a Cheggs. But I wish you a very good night," concluding with this slight remark that there is a young lady growing up at this present moment for me, who has not only great personal attractions but great wealth, and who has requested her next of kin to propose for my hand, which, having a regard for some members of her family, I have consented to promise. It's a gratifying circumstance, which you'll be glad to hear, that a young and lovely girl is growing into a woman expressly on my account, and is now saving up for me. I thought I'd mention it. I have now merely to apologize for trespassing so long upon your attention. Good night." "There's one good thing springs out of all this," said Richard Swiveller to himself when he had reached home and was hanging over the candle with the extinguisher in his hand, "which is that I now go heart and soul, neck and heels, with Fred and all his scheme about little Nellie, and right glad he'll be to find me so strong upon it. He shall know all about that tomorrow, and in the meantime, as it's rather late, I'll try and get a wink of the balmy." The balmy came almost as soon as it was courted. In a very few minutes Mr. Swiveller was fast asleep, dreaming that he had married Nellie Trent, and come into the poverty that his first act of power was to lay waste the market garden of Mr. Cheggs and turn it into a brick field. That was an entertaining chapter. That's it for chapter 8. Be sweet, don't be ugly. Night night.